You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast. This episode's been long in development. It's probably been close to 2 months in preparing, and we'll see how it goes. I didn't expect to be tied up with this one so long. The thing is, the book that I was reading to come up with this episode is big. It's a big old book. Look at this damn thing. Look at this damn thing. Big old book. So it took me a long time to get through the material. It took me an even longer time to scrub it all down to something concise that I can bring to you. But let me just tee this one up by saying this is a book I bought a while ago. I hadn't got around to reading it. I started it, but like a lot of books, you start reading it, then you get away from it. The reason I bought it, the book is by a scholar. He's a Sanskrit professor. Where is he a Sanskrit professor? Harvard. Harvard. So, it's a big deal. E.J. Michael Witzel is the guy's name. And when I found the book, years and years ago, I remember thinking, well, this is kind of the book that I wished that when I was a kid and I thought, the best laid plans, I thought I was going to get my doctorate and become a college professor and teach and publish in the realm of comparative religion and anthropology and psychology, that kind of thing. And what I had in mind was a new attempt at explaining the origin of religion. And this is something that had been done by a lot of people, especially in the 1800s. There was a whole bunch of anthropologists and linguists and ethnologists that proposed theories about where religion comes from as a human instinct and behavior and all that. And it was really interesting. So I thought, like, the origin of the idea of God, that might be something that I would publish on. This was what I thought when I was younger would be my grand contribution to humanity. And I was reading people, again, from the 1800s that did this kind of thing. People like Max Mueller, people like George Fraser, Edward Burnett Tyler, E.B. Tyler. And the list goes on and on. There's a bunch of these early anthropologists, some of the first people that had access to translations of the sacred books of the East, that started noticing linguistic links between Sanskrit and European languages. That kind of was the birth of the discovery of the Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European idea and the connections between the cultures of Europe and Asia. There was all kinds of this sort of thing going on. Some people were doing early comparative religion, talking about stories that maybe came from older stories. When we discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh and some translations of the cuneiform tablets from Iraq and Iran, we found stories that were close to our biblical stories, and there was all kinds of interesting conversations being had about where our religious stories came from and where the idea of God came from. So there were people that talked about sympathetic magic as some sort of an idea that led to a belief in spirituality. There's the breath of life, noticing this idea of a soul coming from witnessing births and witnessing deaths of human beings and seeing the reality of something incorporeal, like a soul that is missing from the dead body and present in the living body. And then there's animism and totemism and all kinds of shamanism, all kinds of early formulations of religion, and speculation about where those ideas came from. And I thought I would contribute to this grand enterprise of where religion comes from. Then I come across this book that we're going to talk about today, E.J. Michael Witzel, who wrote this book. When I started reading it, I thought, man, this is exactly the kind of thing that I imagined I would do. So it's a little bit of a disappointment for me, but also I'm glad someone's done the work. However, when I go and I read the book, I have my criticisms, and I'm going to try to make some of that stuff plain, but we're going to cover a lot of material. There's no way this episode lasts less than 2 hours, so I'm going to try to limit my commentary so I can get to all the good stuff. But I did have some trouble with his writing style. I didn't think he was very efficient. There's a lot of stuff that gets repeated. I don't think the book needed to be as large as it is. Certainly didn't need to take me as long to read and digest it as it did. So I've got, and his conclusions in some cases I don't agree with, but largely I think it's excellent. And what this guy does is he takes a comparative mythological approach, a comparative religion approach, and then he layers in, I don't know, you might call them filters, that are linguistic. So like, where are the relationships of language between these similar myths that you see in different parts of the world, but also archeological evidence and DNA evidence. So in the modern world, we have the technology to not only compare religions from people and say, oh, these are similar, maybe they're related. We can actually say, you know what, I can tell you approximately what time this myth branched off from that group and this group because of the linguistic details, because of the archaeological details, and because of the DNA evidence from the ancient bodies that are discovered and so forth. And so I thought, that is awesome. That is awesome. You know, that's like some real detective work in the field of comparative religion. And something about that revs my engine. I like that idea. So without further ado, I want to jump into this. I'm going to call this episode exactly what the book is titled, The Origins of the World's Mythologies. This one was published back in 2012. I want to tell you one of the things I noticed when I started researching the author, because I didn't know anything about the author apart from reading the book. The author took some flack when he published this book from the woke mob. I don't know if that's a fair statement, but it's a fair statement. He writes an academic book. He puts a lot of time and resources, I assume his life's work essentially, into this book, and he publishes it, and he's called racist. And you're going to kind of see why people are using that on him as we talk about the difference between what he calls Laurasian mythology and Gondwanan mythology. So you're going to see some of that, but I think it's largely unfounded. But another thing that I thought was interesting is a tremendous amount of support in this book for some of the ideas that we talked about on the episode we did on the Archeologos YouTube channel. What did we call that episode? Anyway, if you remember that episode, we talked about the Indo-European people and what Archeologos perceives as a repression of the historical fact of a unity between Indo-European people, and this is being connected to this anti-white racism that we see in the modern world. And I think that Witzel's work that we're going to talk about today actually supports some of the claims that Archeologos brought to the table that I heard for the first time from him, including things that were a surprise to me, like potential connections as far as Japan with the Indo-European migrations. Boy, I did not think that was even on the table. When Archeologos said it, I was very surprised and intrigued. And as you're going to see today, Witzel sort of backs that up. So anyway, I can ramble on and on, but we got a lot to cover today, so here we go. I'm going to jump right into the book here and just kind of lay out the introduction. So Witzel says, even a casual reader is struck by the fact that many myths are very similar to each other, even when they are found in distant parts of the globe and separated by long periods of time. So I don't know what jumps to your mind here, but an example that jumps to my mind is the flood myth, the great flood myth. We have it in the Bible. We know there's an older version in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but we also see it in India, and we see it in China, and we see it among the Hopi Indians in New Mexico. It's very strange that we see it everywhere, even among the Greeks as well. So this is what he means, that there are myths that are really obviously similar to one another, and some of these myths are far apart in space and time, and that's weird. Like, what does that mean? And he says the standard explanation given during the 20th century were either a worldwide diffusion from an ancient culture, which is like a common origin, like some ancient culture had this idea that filters down through all of their descendants. Or, he says, universal characteristics of the human psyche that create similar myths anytime and everywhere. So this idea of universal characteristics of the human psyche plays right into Jungian archetypes and that kind of a thing, which I quite like. But then Witzel says this. He says, both proposals, right, this common origin diffusion proposal and this archetypal proposal, he says they are not nearly comprehensive enough to explain such widespread occurrences. He says, a new approach is proposed in this book. So he's bringing a new approach that's different from diffusion and archetypal, commonalities. He says his book aims at establishing a cladistic family tree of mythological ideas. So you guys all know what that looks like, a family tree, right? So he wants to see, where did this myth originally come from? And how did it change as it branched off and spread throughout the world? He wants to come up with a family tree of myths, or what he calls mythemes, which are just like little themes that appear and reappear in myths. Like myths, of course, are larger stories. So he goes on. He says, once mythologies are compared across space and time, an underlying structure emerges, a storyline extending from the creation of the world to its final destruction. He says this narrative system, however, is not found globally. The mythologies of the Aborigines of Australia, the Melanesians of New Guinea, and most populations of sub-Saharan Africa lack it. Due to its widespread in Eurasia and the Americas, I will call this narrative mythological system Laurasian, following established geological use. The Afro-Australian system I will call Gondwana. Okay, so this really is the only part of this that you might point to when people are calling Witzel a racist. Again, I think an absolutely ridiculous claim. But you know how the world is today. So what he's saying here is that one of the most fascinating characteristics of the commonalities in myths across the world aren't exactly, shared or common themes. It's actually something kind of higher level than that. It's a narrative system. It's a story, right? A storyline that starts with the creation of the world and ends with the destruction of the world. And there's a story to mythology that seems to be a common thread, especially in this Laurasian group of myths. And he says, it's interesting that a certain part of the world population doesn't have this storyline. And those people are the Aborigines of Australia, the Melanesians of New Guinea, and most populations of sub-Saharan Africa. He's going to call the mythology that's common to that group Gondwana mythology. And he's using these words, Laurasian and Gondwana. They're already established geographical terms, so he's using them to apply. Laurasia is basically a region of the globe that includes Europe, Asia, and the Americas, are part of the Americas. And the Gondwana belt, as he calls it, is sub-Saharan Africa, around the kind of coast of, or the north part of India, the coast of Southeast Asia, down into Australia. And what is common? What is common between that group? The Aborigines of Australia, the Melanesians of New Guinea, and the populations of sub-Saharan Africa. What's common about them? They're black people. They're black people. So this is where the racists stick their nose in and say, how dare you suggest there's some difference in the mythological traditions of the people from Africa and the early migrations out of Africa, like the people that wound up in Australia, versus the later migrations and series of migrations that populated the rest of Europe and Asia and eventually the Americas. How dare you, Mr. Witzel? But the truth is, as he's going to point out, there's some significant differences between the mythological systems of these two groups, broadly speaking. It doesn't seem to matter to Witzel what color they are, but it matters to the critics. So that's kind of what I want to point out there. All right, he says, the Laurasian system can be traced to 40,000 years ago, when aspects of it appear in cave paintings. All right, now, we've talked a lot about cave paintings. We've talked about the Sorcerer of Lascaux from France, and the Sorcerer of Les Trois Frères, I should say, the Birdman of Lascaux, all kinds of other cave paintings that are interesting and religious in nature. And he's pointing to these early cave paintings as evidence of this Laurasian system. I think that's interesting. I kind of wish I had some more details on that. But then he goes on, he says, conversely, the Gondwana scheme, so remember this is the sub-Saharan African to Australian group of myths, he says that scheme must have been that of our ancestors who ventured out of Africa some 65,000 years ago and followed the coastline of the Indian Ocean to Australia. A subset of them developed the Laurasian system that became increasingly dominant after the last two ice ages, 50,000 and 20,000 years ago. So notice what he's saying here, just to the critics that call him racist here. What he's saying here is that the Gondwana system of myths is older than the Laurasian system by 25,000 years. That it was the original set of myths that we brought with us as human beings out of Africa. Now, does that seem like it diminishes it? I mean, when he says the Laurasian system was built on or was a subset of this Gondwana scheme, this original mythological scheme, he's basically saying we wouldn't have the Laurasian system without the Gondwana system. So there's nothing derogatory about that. There's nothing that says the Laurasian system is better, but this is what the critics seem to think. All right, he says, it is significant that certain motifs are missing in the Gondwana belt, which generally are confined to the description of the emergence of humans and their culture. So in the Gondwana belt, or we could just say this is the mythological system that seems to be common among Africa and Australia and some of the places in between, the early mythological system. He said in that system, they're only really talking about where humans come from and where their culture comes from. The world is regarded as eternal. So what's missing from the Gondwana system of myths is a cosmogony, like how did the world get here, right? It wasn't a creation like we see in the Bible. It was just always here. There's also no destruction. There's no Ragnarok. There's no Armageddon. There's no end to the story, right? In the Gondwana series of myths, the world is eternal. Human beings come about at some point, and that's that. You don't really have that narrative component. We start here, we end here. And then he proposes something interesting, and he gets into this more in the book, but we're not going to touch on it too much today. He said that a still earlier mythology can be reconstructed when you compare the Laurasian and the Gondwanan systems. It's like he calls it a Pangean system, but I think that's a little bit silly. He's trying to use geological terms, and it's like Pangea, human beings didn't exist when Pangea was a thing. Kind of seems like a strange way of labeling it, but he's talking about the oldest and original myths that we can potentially come up with. He's like, you can deduce when you compare the Laurasian system, what's there and what's not there, when you compare it to the Gondwanan system, and you can kind of parse out what that system might have looked like at an even earlier stage when you compare other myths. And he says that this earlier system of myths, maybe this original system of myths, deals with the creation of humans by what he calls an otois god of the sky. Or odios, I don't know how you say that word. Odios, god of the sky. I looked it up. It means idle or inactive. It's interesting because a lot of sub-Saharan African tribes believe in, what do they call them? Like, there's a Latin name like Dio Ascendum. There's some Latin word that means the God that's not there. The God that was responsible for creation and then just sort of disappears. He's there, but he's not really worshipped. The people don't really even use his name except for in rare instances and rituals, purposes, and that kind of thing. But what's interesting about this is he says what we can garner about the earliest myths of the human race have to do with humans being created by a God that abstains from interacting with human beings after creating humans in the world. There's also a component about the hubris of human beings and their misdeeds, like the original sin idea, and with the emergence of death. So that's all part of this original set of myths. Humans being created, their hubris, their sin, and their eventual death. And then Professor Witzel says something interesting here. He says, "I hasten to add that this reconstruction does not imply the monotheism of W. Schmidt." Now that's a sentence that'll go over many people's heads, especially if you don't know who W. Schmidt is. But I happen to. Father Wilhelm Schmidt was an early anthropologist that talked about the origins of religion. I've read everything that's ever been published by him that's been translated into English. There's lots that are only available in German, and I don't have access to that. I don't speak German, but I know him well. And I want to add here that he says, "I hasten to add," like he's talking about, if we can know anything about our earliest myths, we know that they say human beings were created by a god associated with the sky or the heavens. And then he says, "But I hasten to add, this does not imply some kind of original monotheism, like what was proposed by Wilhelm Schmidt." He gives zero evidence for that. He just says, "I want you to know, don't take this too far. This doesn't mean that religion in its earliest stages was something like a monotheism." Now, I happen to agree with Wilhelm Schmidt. I think that just on the basis of the fact that early beliefs tend to be simpler than later ones. Later ones become more complex over time as we add more things into it, as they interact with other ideas. That's just how everything works with human beings. So you would expect that the earliest idea of God would be simple, and the idea of one God is certainly simpler than the idea of many gods. That logic alone it holds a lot of weight to me. That's not the only piece of evidence for this, but this idea of great gods, high gods is what Wilhelm Schmidt calls them, that when you look at classical religions and ancient religions that worship many gods, in almost all cases there either is or there is a relic of one of those gods having been the original primordial god. All of the other gods were considered to be some sort of manifestations of that one creator, that high god, something much like the way the Hindus consider Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva to really just be Brahma, or Christians believe that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are really just God, this kind of a thing. So I think that Professor Witzel doth protest too much when he's throwing Wilhelm Schmidt under the bus. I don't know why that would be, apart from it's not a popular academic idea. And so he just went ahead and threw that dude under the bus. So that's one of my problems here, but let's move on. This next section I'm going to call How Myths Arise and Spread. So now he's going to talk a little bit about his system and logic. All right, he says, diffusion entails that the similarities between myths are due to a gradual dispersion from a center. Their frequency and distribution allow us to trace the motifs, history, and geographical spread. All right, so remember, he doesn't really believe that diffusion is a good enough explanation, but he's just telling you how it works. If you had a myth that was created in one place, and then you start to see it pop up in places around that center, then there's reasons to believe that the story spread from that center to other places. That's really it. And we can tell by how common the myth is, or how much it's changed from that original myth. We can tell, or we estimate how much time has gone by, or what kind of mixing might have taken place. And this is how they try to deduce where these myths come from and how they spread. Then he says, nowadays, many scholars follow the psychological explanation of Carl Jung and assume that similarities found in myths are secondary elaborations of archetypes. Okay, this is the idea that all human beings have some sort of consistent psychic architecture. Our brains and minds are formed similarly. We have what Jung called archetypes. We have these motivational forces that act on all human beings in a similar way. And there's something kind of numinous about archetypes. There's something that I was born with and you were born with. Not a lot of explanation for how it got there, but it's there in you and me, and it causes us to have certain similarities in our experiences of the world and our lives, and those things, because they are numinous, they easily get associated with divinity and spirituality and things like that. Carl Jung calls archetypes spirits, okay? So he says that those similarities and myths are just elaborations of these archetypes. You know, of course, you're going to have similar myths because human beings have this similar architecture, similar motivations. We think about them similarly. We deify them. So yeah, you're going to see similarities. And then he says, if the Jungian explanation by archetypes were correct, we would expect that individual archetypes would turn up in all parts of the globe. This, however, is debatable. So this is another item that I want to take some issue with. And I don't want to say that Witzel didn't read Jung. I mean, maybe he just doesn't agree with his conclusions, or maybe he's just one of those more rational, logical type of thinkers that never can get his mind in that mystical place that Carl Jung's mind was in. You know, maybe there are reasons for this. But he says, look, if archetypes are the basis of religion, and they're the formulation of these myths and gods and so forth, if that's what they're based on, the models that they're based on, wouldn't we see those same models everywhere? And we don't. Now, Carl Jung, of course, would say that some of those archetypes are embodied and expressed in your life. You're living them out. You're giving them. You're expressing them. You're giving them the light of day. You're making them conscious because they're conscious through you. Those things don't have the same effect on you as the archetypes that are unconscious, right? Those are the ones that are repressed. Those are the ones that we try to ignore or avoid or pretend aren't part of us. And those are the ones that give us these numinous experiences. Those are the ones that try to kind of break through our psyche into consciousness without our permission, you know? And when those things happen, we project them into the world. And there's something very numinous about this. Spirits in my psyche, in my mind, that I'm projecting out into the universe around me. And then I'm having experiences of them as if they aren't me, but they are me. And you have this creation of something that seems external to yourself. Now you have an angel, a spirit, a god, something external to yourself that's impacting you in a way that you don't understand. And not all people, and certainly not all cultures, are going to express those archetypes the same way, right? Some of them are unconscious. Some of them are conscious. That pattern is not going to be identical from person to person or from culture to culture. This is why archetypes are not expressed uniformly in all mythologies. It's a very simple explanation, and I think that his pushing back against people like Carl Jung and Wilhelm Schmidt, who are two of my largest influences, is a rejection of the mystical. It's a rejection of the mystical. And, fair enough for an academic. I think it's a mistake, but I understand. All right, he says, I will show that a large number of present and past mythologies go back to a single source, and that the descendant mythologies maintain enough similarities to allow the discovery of original features. So he's going to compare the myths so he can deduce what the myths were like in their original state before they filtered themselves down into these various versions across space and time. He says all Laurasian mythology can be traced to greater Southwest Asia, from where it spread across Eurasia long before the immigration of the Amerindian populations into North America. Right? He knows this because the Indian populations in North America shared the same mythological storyline as the ones in Europe and Asia. So those myths had to have predated the migration of the Amerindian populations into North America. So that may be 10,000 BC or earlier. He says the Laurasian mythologies include the population speaking Uralic, Altaic, Japanese, Afro-Asiatic, Indo-European, Tibeto-Burmese, and Austric languages. Those are South Asian, Southeast Asian, Polynesian languages. all of that group shares this Laurasian storyline. So they must have all descended from a common source, something like that. He says they also include the written mythologies of ancient Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, ancient India, and China. All of that. Imagine that. A common mythological system that was present in the populations that spread to all of those areas, speaking all of those languages. Imagine rewinding the clock and going back to where that began to find this original system of myths. He says, Laurasian mythology has been spread not by diffusion, but by the constant advance of humans. After their exodus out of Africa into northern Eurasia and beyond, after the past 2 ice ages. So this is his alternative, right? It's not just diffusion. It's not just archetypal nature of the human mind. It's what he calls the constant advance of humans, right? He's talking about waves and waves of people coming out of Africa into Europe and Asia, going from, Asia into Europe, going from, Africa to Australia, and that this is not something that happened once or in discrete, sections. This is something that happened continually over time, not in regular patterns, but in irregular patterns. And so imagine you have myths in Africa that are our original stories of human beings. Maybe they go back 100,000 years. And then human beings come out of Africa 65,000 years ago. Modern humans, we're not speaking about Neanderthals right now. Modern humans come out of Africa 65,000 years ago, and they spread around. And those myths change a little as time goes by. But then what happens when the next wave comes out of Africa? Right? Remember, they still have the old myths. Maybe they're close to the original. Maybe they've changed in their own ways. And now that wave of people comes back into Europe and Asia and mixes with the people that came out of Africa some thousands of years before that. And then their myths start having sex and changing, right? That's what happens with human culture. So you get waves and waves and waves of original stories and modified versions coming into contact with people of different cultures and different languages over and over and over again through time. It is a complex tapestry that there's really no hope of unwinding in detail. And he wants to give us some examples. And I want to read you some of these examples that he points out when he's talking about connections between myths across time and space. Okay, and I'll just read a few. He says the appearance of the rainbow snake motif. Right, there's the rainbow snake motif. He says you see it in India, but also in South America and Australia and in sub-Saharan Africa. Right, the rainbow envisioned as a serpent and the stories surrounding that. You see that in India, South America, Australia, and sub-Saharan Africa. He's like, other cases include the motif of human origins from a tree. The stories about human beings and the origin of human beings being associated with a tree. He said we see that in sub-Saharan Africa. We see it in Taiwan and Japan and Australia. How about these cosmological sand paintings that you see among the Navajo? You see identical versions among the Tibetans. He says, how about similar colors associated with the cardinal directions? You see that in China, in Iran, and in North and South America. And then there's myths about the ages of human beings that came and went. There's either 4 or 5 ages that you see appearing in different myths, and even the colors applied to them. They're the in the Greek version, the people were made from gold, and then from silver, and then from bronze, and then from clay. So there's colors associated with them, and you see the similarities among the Greek stories and the Navajo stories. What could be the explanation? There has to be some commonality there among people as disparate as the ancient Greeks and the Navajo, something connecting them. He said, isolated and unmotivated similarities found in widely separated areas usually are indicators of an older system higher up on that cladistic family tree. He He says the fact that they don't seem to be motivated marks them as functionally unexplained or as some kind of a relic. He says examples include the weeping of the separated Father Heaven and Mother Earth, which you see in Maori myth, that's Polynesian myth, but also in the Rig Veda from India. And this motif of showing bare breasts as a sign of friendship, that's something that you see among the Gilyak tribes in Siberia, but you also see it in the Rig Veda in India, and also in Crete among the Minoans. If you've ever seen the women, the clothing of the women in ancient Crete, and when he says that when they're not motivated, this marks them off as something particularly interested. This means that there isn't any reason that's obvious why this story is there. Maybe it doesn't seem to go with the rest of the stories. There's something about it that it doesn't have a function really in the system. It's just sort of there. It's a weird relic. That to him is evidence that it goes back to something ancient, something that its meaning has been sort of lost, and it sticks around, but nobody seems to know why. And if you think that's strange, it's not strange. Think about the marriage ceremony. The modern Western marriage ceremony. This is a good example. The woman wears a veil and she comes up to the altar with her bridesmaids all dressed just like her. You might ask, well, what is that tradition about? The tradition is about obscuring the face of the bride so that the evil spirits don't know who is getting married, so that they can't curse her in her marriage. You cover her face with a veil so the demons can't see who it is. Same reason she has her bridesmaids there. It's a little, I don't know if you guys remember in the Harry Potter book or movie, what it was, like the fifth one or something. Whenever he's trying to escape his house, the house of his aunt and uncle, the charm that's protecting him is going to wear off when he turns 17. And so all of the wizards come there and they all take polyjuice potions so everyone looks like Harry Potter, and then they escape. And while the Death Eaters are coming after them, nobody can tell who the real Harry Potter is because everybody looks like Harry Potter and they're going in different directions. This is why women have bridesmaids when they get married, so that the spirits are confused as to which one is the bride. You see, we carry those traditions with us long after we even know why we do it. So when we see something like this appearing in myth, it gives us some evidence that this goes back beyond, we've lost its origin basically, but it's there. We still keep it. He says, we can begin the reconstruction of Laurasian mythology, starting from observing obvious similarities. One needs 2 or 3 identical or similar items to establish a common ancestral element. So he's saying, look, it's not enough if there's one, sort of similar thing that appears here and there. You need a cluster of similarities to really give yourself evidence that there's a link. That's all he's saying. Then he says, widely distant remote mythologies are especially useful. Items that the Polynesians share with the Hebrew Bible or with Scandinavian myth must belong to the common Eurasian stock of myths, and they present us with a shortcut in the reconstruction of Laurasian mythology. All right, so, fair enough. He's saying if you have myths that are separated by a long distance or a lot of time, but they're similar, that gives you some really good examples to compare. You can see what is common between these two myths. They have something in common, but they've changed a dramatic amount because of the cultural changes and the time that's gone by. But there's something common between the two, and that, whatever that commonality is, must be part of the original myth. See, that's how they're going to start reconstructing these things. He says, the congruence between Amerindian and Eurasian myths must be older than the Amerindian migration. That's 20,000 BC is what he's approximating. So, for example, many aspects of the myths concerning the first mortals, the first evil deed, are very similar in ancient India, Iran, the Hebrew Bible, Polynesia, and Japan, and in Amerindian myths. Most of them result in some kind of a punishment, usually by a flood. Okay, so that's enough in terms of similarities to really give you evidence of the antiquity of such an idea as original sin and punishment by a flood. That must go back a long way to appear in Polynesia and Japan, as well as India and Iran. He says the comparison of mythological motifs allows us to establish a number of similarities, but also more or less arranged in a particular order, which takes shape as a mythical history. So this is the storyline component that Laurasian mythology has in common, that he puts the most emphasis on. He says Laurasian mythology represents our oldest complex story. He says it is ideology and narrative form. According to this worldview, the universe is regarded as a living body in analogy to the human one. It's born, grows, and finally dies. So this is why the Laurasian story has a birth, the birth of the cosmos, creation, and then the demise of the cosmos. It's some analogy to the human body. Now, when he says that the Laurasian storyline or mythological history is ideology and narrative form, what he means is it's a way of viewing the world and our place in it. Like, we understand our place in the world based upon the myths we tell, the stories we tell. And if the stories we tell are that God created the heavens and the earth, and then God created human beings, it puts us in a particular context. We're subservient to this great ethereal power. We are aware of some intelligence and some life, some cause for life and consciousness that's beyond the material world. It's something abstract that we call God. So it really is ideology, narrative form. It puts some sort of a framework to our understanding of ourselves, the world, and our place in it. He says, after comparing many myths across Laurasia based on the oldest versions and listing them in order, we arrive at their probable initial stage. Its storyline includes some 15 major mythological themes, the most important ingredients of the major mythologies involved, from Iceland to Tierra del Fuego. This is like from the Arctic North all the way down to the southern tip of South America. And these are those 15 ingredients. The first 3 or 4 have to do with creation. And the first one is primordial waters or chaos. The second one is a primordial egg or a giant. The third is a primordial hill or island. And the fourth is a Father Heaven and Mother Earth type of character and their children, their generations of children, all the other gods and how they came to be. Number 5 is a pushing up of heaven or a separation of the heavens and the earth. The 6th is the hidden sunlight is revealed. So, God said, let there be light. The 7th is the current gods defeat their predecessors. So you have kind of a war of gods, of earlier and later gods, a battle, a clash of the titans. Then you have the killing of a dragon to fertilize the earth, something like that, or the killing of a monster. Then you have the emergence of humans. So the gods come first, then humans, and usually they descend from the sun or a deity of the sun. Then there's some human evil, like the origin of sin and death. Usually that has to do with some punishment, like the flood. Then there's a history of semi-divine heroes that basically talks about the creation of human beings and culture. And so that's where we come to the next bit, which has to do with the theft of fire. That's the story of Prometheus, the bringing of culture, like what we hear in the book of Enoch, if you're familiar with the apocryphal stories. And then you basically have the beginning of ordinary history at that point. And then that ends with the final destruction of the world. And then a new heaven and earth are created, a new start. And so this is the storyline in, really high level. This is the reconstruction of the storyline, the commonalities that exist across all of the mythologies in the Laurasian world, which is essentially all of Europe, Asia, Siberia, North America, South America, basically that whole stretch of land and the people that have lived there, for tens of thousands of years. That brings me to the next section. I'm just going to call this one examples of common myth themes. So this is just going to give you a little bit more to chew on. So we're going to talk about just a couple of examples. So there's a founding myth of a people called the Koguryo. They're a North Korean tribe from the first century AD. And they have a myth, and it's got some details along the lines of this. A woman who's the daughter of a river god is impregnated by the rays of the sun, and she gives birth to an egg and produces the first king. Okay, so a woman associated with the river god is impregnated by the sun. She lays an egg, and from the egg is hatched the first king. All right, now he wants to show you the parallels. He says this myth echoes an Indo-Iranian myth called about Martanda. Okay, so we're going from North Korea to Iran. Okay, now the story of Martanda is the son of the sun deity, born from an egg. Okay, or in Finland, there's a holy book called the Kalevala, and in that one, Ilmatar is the daughter of the air, swimming in the ocean, giving birth to 7 eggs. And a similar story that he says comes from the Wei history in China about 550 AD. So in all of these stories, you've got these commonalities. You've got a woman who is the daughter of a god, whether that's the sun deity, the river deity, the air, and she gets impregnated, and always something to do with the sun. She's impregnated by the sun, or Martanda, who is the descendant of the sun, and they all lay eggs. So you see some more than one common theme within these larger myths all across the world. And there's some more. He says, in the Greek myth, Kronos, the son of the primordial Uranus, that's heaven. So Kronos is the son of heaven, and Gaia. We all know Gaia is the Mother Earth. So it goes like this. The Greek myth Kronos, the son of Uranus and Gaia, kills and castrates his father, cutting off his testicles with a sickle. So you have Kronos cutting off the testicles of his father, heaven. Now he says, in a Near Eastern version from the Hittite people, the son of heaven is called Kumarbi. And Kumarbi bites off and swallows the testicles of his father and becomes pregnant by them. And of course, he doesn't bring this one up, but another one that comes to my mind is the story of Isis. Isis and Osiris from ancient Greece. If you remember, Osiris is decapitated and dismembered, and Isis pulls his dismembered penis out of the Nile, and she makes herself pregnant with it. Just like Kumarbi bites off his father's testicles and becomes pregnant by them. So you see some common theme here. The son of heaven emasculates and dismembers, his father, and becomes pregnant by it. The fertility of the father passes to the son, something like that. Then he says the Japanese motif of the diver bird, which we see in the Kojiki, which is a ancient Japanese mythical history sort of thing. He says that's widely spread in Siberia and North America, even in Australia, he says. He says the churning of the ocean by Izanami and Izanagi in Japanese myth is also found in India, as is the motif of the apples or peaches of paradise. Now, if the apples of paradise sound familiar to you, we of course have the sacred fruit on the tree of life in the biblical Garden of Eden. We have the golden apples of Hesperides in the ancient Greek myth. So something similar you see in Japan with these peaches of paradise. So this is showing you how you might notice these common motifs across wide spreads of time and space. And when you find them, you must realize that when there's a few commonalities like this, it's almost certain that they come from some older original myth that spread down the line to these other people. And that brings me to the next section where I just want to focus on these creation stories. So I'm going to call this section In the Beginning, but this one's called Out of Nothing. Professor Witzel says, myths about the beginning of the universe are the most prominent feature in Laurasian mythology. And I want to stop there for a second because creation stories are my favorite. I don't know of any religious story or any myth that is more closely associated with God in and of itself. Like if you want to know about God, we go to the creation stories. There's almost nothing as direct as creation stories. If what you're interested in is what God is and how God was understood by ancient people. And this happens to be the paramount theme in Laurasian mythology. He says there is a widespread notion of the emergence of the universe out of primordial darkness, chaos, non-being, or some kind of primordial waters. So this is sort of a common theme. And let me just read to you a couple of snippets from different parts of the world to help you understand this idea of creation out of nothing or out of chaos or darkness. So the Roman poet Ovid said this, quote, "Before the ocean and the earth appeared, before the skies had overspread them, the face of nature in a vast expanse was not but chaos." And I'll give you one from the Polynesian Maori tribe. It goes like this, quote, "At the beginning of time, there stood Te Kore, the nothingness. Then was Te Po, the night. The beginning was made from nothing." And I'll give you one from the Rig Veda, although there's several creation myths from the Rig Veda in India. One of them goes like this, quote, "There was neither being nor non-being. What turned? Where? Only a deep abyss. It breathed windless. Darkness was hidden by darkness." Whew, buddy. How about a Chinese version? I'm almost certainly going to mispronounce this book, but this is also on my list to read. Huainan Zi, this is the name of the book. Again, Chinese mythical history, and I'll give you a quote from the Huainan Zi. Quote, "In a time when heaven and earth were without form, the Tao began in the immense emptiness." How about one from Old Greek? If you want to look at the stories from Hesiod, they go like this. Quote, "First there was chaos. In it Nyx and Erebos." So Nyx is night, a female deity associated with the night. Erebos is a male deity associated with darkness. So it really sounds something like this. First there was chaos. In it night and darkness. Man. All right, how about the Norse version from the Edda? Quote, "There was chaos at the time of the beginning of the world. A yawning gap or a yawning abyss." How about a New World version? If we look at the version from the Popol Vuh, the Mayan holy book, it says, "In the beginning, all was in suspense, motionless, quiet. The face of the earth was not yet seen. Only the sea and the expanse of the heavens, for as yet naught existed. Alone was the Creator, the plumed serpent." So nothing exists, right? The biblical, let me just read the biblical. "In the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." I mean, let's look at this again. Look at how similar the Mayan version is to the biblical version. The Mayan version says, in the beginning, the face of the earth was not yet seen. The Bible says, in the beginning, the earth was without form, right? The Mayan version says, for as yet nothing existed. Alone was the Creator. And the biblical version says, and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the deep. The Spirit of God is there. Nothing is there but the Spirit of God. The Popol Vuh says nothing was there but the plumed serpent. It's inexplicable, the level of overlap, the level of concordance. It's inexplicable. It's amazing. There's something significant about this idea of the nothingness, the chaos, the darkness. In all of these stories, all across the globe, it is not nothing in the sense of emptiness or non-being or lack. It's not that. It's something else. It's something that I've tried to describe before when I talk about the Ouroboros or the union of opposites. It's something like everything, what I like to call potentiality. It's like whatever it is that can become anything that exists or can exist, that thing. Imagine all of that put together, everything rolled into one. See, that becomes nothing, right? Because it's everything together is nothing specific. It's all things put together. There's no individual thing you can point to. All of it is together. So in that way, it's nothing. And a similar analogy, you can think about, all the colors mixed together, all the wavelengths of light. When you put them together, they become white light, and you don't see any of the color anymore. You take all of the colors of light, you put them together, and you get no light at all. This mystical idea is what these Laurasian people were talking about when they said, in the beginning there was this nothing, and from that nothing everything came. It's not a creation ex nihilo. It's not a creation from non-existence. It's a creation from some type of existence that is unknowable. And they're going to call it nothing. But we make a mistake if we take that literally. And there's no doubt about it when you read the myths. This nothing, this chaos, this darkness is pregnant with everything that ever will be. You cannot call that nothing. You can call that God. That brings me to the next subsection here of in the beginning. I'm going to call this one from the waters. So Witzel says, the idea of primeval waters is closely connected with that of primeval darkness or chaos. Chaos is often identified with a watery waste. Let me just stop there for a second to explain something significant about this. There is a connection widely accepted and known among depth psychologists like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud and that whole lot. And what they say is that water, when it appears in myths or in even your own dreams, very commonly represents the unconscious. The unconscious is something like this idea of the nothingness or the chaos. It's this dark abyss that's attached to us, but also foreign to us. And things can come from the unconscious. Things can be harvested from the unconscious. Things that your conscious side doesn't know. And there's something very mysterious about that. The unconscious is associated with the waters, the deep. So he says the primeval waters is closely associated with the darkness or the chaos, this idea of potentiality. It's like anything can come from potential. Anything can rise up from the darkness of the ocean, from the vast darkness of the ocean where you can't see. There's no end to it. It's limitless. The same thing with space even. An asteroid comes out of nowhere. We don't have any idea, and suddenly it's a existential threat. What could be out there in space? Anything. This is the idea. And he gives an example of this idea of creation from the waters. He's like, in the Mesopotamian creation story, that's the Enuma Elish, it starts with the union of salty and sweet water. Right? That's Tiamat and Hapsu. So creation starts from water. In the Egyptian version, same thing. The universe is a vast ocean called Nun. And then he gives us a little bit from a particular Egyptian myth from Heliopolis. So every one of the sort of city-states in ancient Egypt had different myths, and they did some combining, but this one is from Heliopolis, and it goes like this. It's talking about the creator god, which there is Atum. And Atum is born from Nun, right? Born from the universe, this vast ocean, this whatever existed before creation. It says, the Lord of all, this is Atum, after having come into being, says, I am who came into being as Khepri. This is the becoming one. When I came into being, the beings became into being. Numerous are those who came out of my mouth before heaven existed. I was bound to them in the watery abyss. All right, so Atum is called the becoming one. So he's this god that everything's going to come from. And it says that from his mouth, all of the other gods are pouring forth, but there's nowhere for them to go. It says that they're bound to him in the watery abyss. So in Nun, in this potentiality, there's the one God that creates. And all of the gods that are being created by him are stuck there with him in this watery abyss. This is the same story we hear in Mesopotamia from about Tiamat and Apsu. See, they're in sexual union, so they're together, they're one thing. Opposites, the male, the female, the salt water, the sweet water, they're together in sexual union, and so they're creating. But the things they're creating have nowhere to go because they're being created within this one thing, within this watery abyss. And then he gives us a Native American version from the Omaha tribe. It's really interesting. Brief but interesting. It says, at the beginning, all things were in the mind of Wakanda. All creatures, including man, were spirits. They descended to the earth and saw it was covered with water. All right, so I just have to say, I didn't know this. I hadn't seen this myth before, but I'm interested. This is absolutely fantastic. So he says, in the beginning, all things were in the mind of Wakanda. Wakanda is this creator god, this primordial high god, right? This is the one that Witzel doesn't want you to get confused and think that the Native Americans believed in a monotheism, but here it is. All things existed within the mind of God. God, one God, right? The high God. That from which all the other spirits and gods emerge. So what I want to point to here is something interesting, is that all things exist in the mind of God. This is a kind of idealism. This is a philosophy that we call idealism today. It's associated with ancient India, but also with modern German philosophers like Hegel. But this idea of idealism is that essentially consciousness is the thing that's fundamental in the world. It's not matter like scientists think. It's actually consciousness. And there's all kinds of interesting philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead who said similar things. All things are ideas in the mind of God. That's very much like what Plato said at the beginning of modern or classical Greek philosophy. The mind of God, Plato calls nous. And all of the things that exist are the forms. This is exactly what Alfred North Whitehead would say, many, many centuries later. The important thing here is that everything is considered to be a spirit existing in the mind of God. And when they descend to the earth, it's not clear what that means. If everything is existing in the mind of God, another kind of interesting paradox of idealism, they descended to earth and saw it was covered with water. So you see this common theme, the watery abyss, water, Nun, the ocean. This is a common theme in these creation stories. All right. That brings me to the next section about creation, so in the beginning. But I'm going to call this section pandeism. And we've talked about this in the previous episodes, but I think it's worth going over it again. Pandeism is an idea that means whatever God is identical with the cosmos. Either God is himself, itself, identical to the cosmos, or the spirit that creates, if we call that thing God, became the cosmos, something like that. All right, so let's get into it. He says there are also versions of a primordial giant or an egg. So we've talked about water and some other thing, darkness and nothingness, but there are other versions that have to do with a giant or an egg. He says the giant was in existence before the world emerged. So the giant is the pre-existing thing. It's the eternal thing. And the giant somehow gets killed, and the parts of its body become the heavens and the earth. So there are examples of this in the Germanic figure of Ymir. There's a parallel in India from the Rig Veda about Purusa. In old China, there's a similar version of a giant called Pangu. And then he says that there's a similar myth in Greece that has to do with the spilling of Kronos' blood to fertilize the earth, or the Mesopotamian creation story where a human being is created only by killing a god. Right? This god is called Kingu, and the blood of the god is used to create human beings. So in all of these stories, you have a god who is dismembered, and its body is necessary either to create the world or to fertilize the world to make it habitable for life. So let's just read some of these. From the Rig Veda, quote, "The gods offered him for themselves. When they portioned out Purusa, the moon has been born from his mind, the sun from his eye. From his mouth was born Indra in agony. From his breath the wind. From his navel the atmosphere. From his head heaven. From his feet the earth." And let's compare that to the Old Norse Edda that goes like this, quote, "From Ymir's flesh the earth was created. From the sweat the sea. From the bones the mountains. From the hairs the trees. From the skull heaven." He says this is an old Indo-European idea. It's strengthened by this relationship between the Old Norse myth of the god Odin, who hung himself on the Yggdrasil tree for 9 days, an offering by himself to himself. So what he's saying here is this story of Ymir, right, where the god is the ancient giant is destroyed in order to create the world. You have something similar with the idea of Odin, who offers his life. The high god himself offers him his life as a sacrifice to himself. And if you think that idea might sound strange, is that, rather than sacrificing to a god, you have the god sacrificing to himself. Well, we have that same parallel in Christianity. Jesus is God and does voluntarily sacrifice himself to God. Right? He is the sacrifice, the Lamb of God. He is the sacrifice that is the solution to the sins of humankind. God is being sacrificed to himself. And now we get to the Chinese version. First there was the cosmic egg. Inside was chaos, and floating in chaos was Pangu, the divine embryo. Pangu burst out of the egg. He chiseled the land and sky apart. The world was never finished until Pangu died. From his skull was shaped the dome of the sky, from his flesh the soil, from his bones the rocks, from his blood the rivers and seas, from his hair vegetation. His breath was the wind. His voice made thunder. His right eye the moon, his left eye the sun. From his sweat came rain. From the vermin which covered his body came mankind. All right, so the next section in this creation story bit in the beginning, I'm going to call the chicken paradox, because here we're going to talk about the egg motif. Witzel says, still another version of the creation is that of a primordial egg. The universe is created by splitting up an egg. Its upper half becomes the vault of the sky, and the lower part the earth. The myth theme of the eggshell becoming the sky is closely related to the primordial giant's skull as the vault of heaven. In fact, the words for skull and cup are the same in many ancient languages. Isn't that interesting? So when we have the story of the giant, in every case, it's his skull that becomes heaven. And what they're saying here is that at some point this became an egg, and the top of the egg becomes the vault of heaven, just like the top of the skull becomes the vault of heaven. So there's this connection, and it's deeper than that too. This is one of those linguistic pieces of evidence that the word the ancient human beings used for cup and for skull were the same word. So you can see where the story might have changed, where the interpretation might have taken over, and the story became either from a giant to an egg or from an egg to a giant. And of course, that says nothing about the fact that that likely means human beings were drinking out of skulls for much of ancient times. Like before we learned how to make pottery, we may have very well been eating and drinking out of skulls. Not necessarily human skulls, but nonetheless. All right, he says an older version found in the Rig Veda speaks of a golden embryo in the midst of the high waters, from which developed the myth. From which all developed. Okay, so you have some parallels, like we just saw in the Pangu story. We have this idea of an embryo inside an egg, and the embryo's floating in the waters. So you have a connection here between the egg and the waters. He says the myth is also found in Greece, Finland, China, Indonesia, Hawaii, and New Zealand. This idea of a golden embryo of an egg in the waters. We see that myth essentially all over the Laurasian world, as far away as New Zealand and Hawaii. So we're starting to see these creation myths are linked. Can the myth of the origin of the world from an egg be linked to the primordial waters? And Witzel says water is a prominent part of the contents of an egg. Inside these fluids, the primeval germ was created. The two halves of the egg are also linked to the skull of the primordial giant. So you see how these creation stories are just weaving in and out of one another. And then he says, the original Laurasian creation myth must have envisaged darkness hovering over primordial waters. Out of this, the earth emerged and had to be stabilized and separated from heaven. So in all these myths, if we want to rewind the clock and see those common components and understand that those common components must have been there in the original story, then the best we can do is say that the original story that links people as far afield as Greece, Finland, and New Zealand, originally they believed that there was darkness in the beginning, hovering over primordial waters, and out of water the earth emerged and had to be separated from heaven. That this is the common story. All right, that brings me to the last, the next piece anyway. I'm going to call it the Ouroboros. If you don't remember me talking about the Ouroboros in the past, this is an idea of opposites in union. And it's a religious symbol, usually depicted as a snake swallowing its own tail, or as the yin-yang symbol, or something like that. And it's a very ancient, maybe even the most ancient, symbol of God, the Ouroboros. And Witzel says this, the ancient Shinto Norito texts, so we're going back to ancient Japan, they reveal there are two gods who existed before all other creation. The male god is called Kemuro-gi, and the female Kamuro-mi. He says they represent the primordial pair, in Indo-European terms, Father Heaven and Mother Earth. So we have this, and we're going to see this in more detail, but this Father Heaven, Mother Earth motif all throughout Laurasian mythology. And in Japan, we have this interesting sort of little-known but ancient story of Kamuro-gi and Kamuro-mi. And then he explains what those names mean. Okay, so both of those names contain the word for God, kamu or kami. That means God or spirit in the Shinto faith. And then the suffixes gi and mi essentially mean male or female. So in the more familiar Japanese creation story, Azama-gi and Azana-mi, right? Those are the primordial god and goddess. So again, Kamuro-gi and Kamuro-mi are basically the male god and the female god, if that makes sense to you. And then that brings to mind something from the Bible that I just want to insert as an aside. When the Bible talks about man being created in God's image, it says, male and female, he created them. So I want you to see that even in the Bible, God's image is male and female. Human beings are made in the image of God, male and female. So whatever God is, it's something like the union of opposites, man and woman together. And this is the exact same symbol we see in classical mythology. In Mesopotamia, it's Tiamat and Apsu, the male and the female. You know, the union of opposites, the salt and the sweet water. We have the same in Egypt with Isis and Osiris, the great god and the great goddess. Again, in Indo-European terms, we just generally see this as Father Heaven, Mother Earth. So let's get into that. He says, the emergence of heaven and earth form a primordial sexual union. This is a very common theme in Eurasian mythologies. He says, to quote the Maori version, so this goes back to Polynesia, Rangi and Papa were in permanent sexual union, so that their children were kept in permanent darkness between them. A variation of the motif of primordial darkness before creation, until both were pushed apart permanently. So this is interesting. When we see this idea of the darkness being there in the beginning, and we want to assume that means there's no sun and there's no nothing, it's just empty darkness. This story gives a different perspective, which I really like. Ragni and Papa, heaven and earth, the female and the male god, the primordial gods, they're together, they're in union, just like Tiamat and Apsu, they're in sexual union, opposites in union. And the darkness that was there in the beginning is that union. Right? All of the things are being created in this sexual union of the great god and the great goddess, in the union of opposites. This is a creative act, and all the creation is going on inside of this unity. Because all things are there together, and because the male and the female god, the opposites, are there together, there is no light, there is no nothing. Everything is darkness. So the darkness that was there in the beginning is this symbol of the Ouroboros. I want you to see that. It's not an ex nihilo, it's not out of nothing. It is something else. And this permanent darkness where all of the creation is trapped until heaven and earth are separated, giving those gods and powers and beings a place to exist. They're in darkness. And the heavens and earth need to be pushed apart. Now, and this isn't in the book too, but I want to mention there's another similarity here that comes to mind from ancient Greece. If you remember the story of the first realm, the first gods being born, the Titans, and then the second wave, the Olympians being born, Kronos is the king initially, and he's afraid that his children are going to usurp his position. So what does he do when they're born? He swallows them. Kronos swallows all of his children. And what does that do? It keeps them from being born. It keeps them in the darkness. It keeps them inside, right? And so this, I think, is another parallel. All right, then he says, the Greek Zeus Pater, that's who we would typically call Zeus. Zeus Pater, that's the sky father, if you don't know. And Demeter, he's giving this as an example of the Father Heaven, Mother Earth. And I have to say, I knew Zeus Pater, the Sky Father, was this common Indo-European high god, figure. I never really considered that Demeter was the opposite, was the earth mother. I generally think about Gaia and Uranus, heaven and earth, and these come way before Zeus and Demeter. But then it dawns on me that the word Demeter may very well be a combination of two words. De, which of course we know means God, and meter or mater, which we know means mother. So Zeus pater and De mater are the male god and the female god. Isn't that interesting? The union of opposites. And then he goes on to explain that in the Rig Veda that Zeus pater is Dayas Pita, the father of heaven or the sky father, and Pravit Mata, which is the earth mother. And so they have this Proto-Indo-European root that goes back some 3,500 BC, something like that. But then he says that those same ideas we see reflected in early Indo-European, but also Altaic languages like Turkic, Mongolian, and Korean. And in China also, remember, heaven is created from the male yang and the earth from the female yin. So just like Uranus and Gaia, or Zeus and Demeter, or Tiamat and Apsu, we have yin and yang. And then he says, according to the Enuma Elish of Mesopotamia, in the beginning the gods of salty and sweet water, Apsu and Tiamat, have several sons. These are the gods that are being born within them, and they reside inside her body. The myth is somewhat different in Egypt, where it is the female sky who covers the male earth. So you have the sort of the sexes switched, but it's the same symbol. And so what's important that we're coming up to is this idea of separation. And this is something that's associated with creation. We see it in the Bible, even though it's not super obvious to many people. When you read the creation story in the Bible, it is creation through separation. In the beginning, there's just the abyss. There's just the primordial deep. And that God is on the surface, right? That's what you have. But what happens is that the light is separated from the darkness. The heavens are separated from the earth. Eve is separated from Adam's rib. The whole thing is a process of separation. And just like we go back to this Ouroboros idea of the union of opposites, the great God and goddess together, and all this creation that's happening is happening in the darkness within them, in this realm that doesn't really exist yet. It doesn't have a place to exist. There needs to be a separation. And the space between, that's this place that we call being or the cosmos. That's the place where something can actually exist. So this separation has to happen. And that's what we're going to get into in this section I'm going to call separation as creation. And Witzel says, when heaven and earth emerge, they are at first in continuous union. They had to be separated, often carried out by a special deity, such as the Tane Muhata in Polynesian, Indra in Indian, or Shu in Egyptian mythology. The propping up of the sky is brought about in various ways by a pole or a pillar or a tree or a mountain or even a giant, which is another connection back to the Ymir Pangu theme that we just talked about. And this giant, he says, it's called Upalori, who carries heaven in Hittite mythology. In Greek myth, that giant is called Atlas, who carries heaven on his shoulders. That brings me to another version, which I'm going to call the tree. He says, a more common version of this heavenly prop is that of a pole or a tree. The world tree is usually thought of as reaching down with its roots into the netherworld and reaching up with its top branches into heaven. And the classic version of this is the Germanic Yggdrasil tree. He says, such images as the world tree are found in the Baltic Islands, in Finland, in Siberia, and in the Americas, but also in Polynesia. He says the Marquesans mention, quote, the tree of life firmly rooted in heaven above. In Japan, the world tree is represented as the Himagori tree, on which the gods descend. So it's a connection between the heavens and the earth. He says, even the Aboriginal Semang of Malaysia, who otherwise follow the Gondwana pattern, have this myth. So this world tree is something that maybe goes back even to an earlier phase of human mythology, maybe even the original one. And that makes a lot of sense when you consider human beings evolved from animals that spend a lot of time in the trees. And trees were home, and they were comfort, and they were food, and they were all kinds of things to us. And it makes a lot of sense that we would consider them sacred and carry that with us. And he says, for an explanation of the world tree, one must look back to shamanistic belief that a tree connects the netherworld, this world, and heaven. They climb a tree symbolizing the ascent to heaven. Okay, so a shaman who goes into the spirit world, maybe that's through meditation or prayer or ecstatic ritual or psychedelic drugs or whatever it might be. The shaman goes into this altered state of consciousness, and his traveling, his disembodied or spiritual traveling to the realm of the gods, whether that be to Tartarus in the netherworld, the world of the dead, where he encounters souls of the dead, that kind of thing, or up to heaven, where he encounters spirits and angels and gods, he receives prophecy, whatever it might be. There's this idea of a tree that connects them. And so it becomes the conduit that connects all of the realms. This is exactly the way that Yggdrasil was depicted in Norse mythology. All of the different realms existed in this tree. All right, the next related bit is I'm going to call the pole or pillar. It says a pole or pillar appears as the representation of the world tree. The Tuk pole in Polynesia and as Heracles pillars on the Atlantic. Those are the Straits of Gibraltar. In the Vedic creation myth, it is personified as Indra, who stretches out his arms to stem apart and support the sky. In the Americas, as the tribal pole of the Lakota Sioux, or as the pole around which the Mexican voladores descend down to earth. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but literally, it's a couple stories high pole, and these people dressed in costume, they climb up to the top of it, and they're suspended by ropes, and they jump off the top, and they just sort of spin and circumambulate down this pole. It's pretty amazing. He says it appears as Yggdrasil in Old Norse myth and as Irminsul in Germany. A feature continued to this day in the Maypole festival. In Japan, the pole is the pillar the primordial deities Izanami and Izanagi circumambulated before they created the gods. So the pole, he says, becomes the axis mundi. It's the center of things, He says it's doubtless a reminiscence of the nighttime sky around the pole star, and it establishes a direct connection with the gods in heaven. And I can't help but think about Jacob's ladder from the Bible, a similar thing, a pole connecting heaven and earth to which the spirits are moving up and down. I think it's interesting because there's this shamanic connection between this idea of the axis mundi, and he says, imagine you're an ancient person and you're observing the night sky, which we know that they did, and you see the constellations of stars that are moving around a center, right, in heaven that never seems to move. That's what they call the pole star. And so it must seem like the world is suspended by a pole, and everything's moving around it. And in a way it is. He says a close relative of the pillar motif is that of actual mountains. The most well-known is the Atlas Mountains, but the motif is also found in India as the Meru Mountain, and mountains later are represented by pyramids, like in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, Egypt, And all of that, the pyramid coming up to a point, this sort of hierarchical view, it represents coming from the earth up to heaven, right? It represents that connection between the realm of the gods and a man. Okay, that brings me to the next bit, which I'm going to call Slaying of the Dragon. So this has to do with the great hero story that, most mythologies have some rendition of. Witzel tells us, after the initial creation of the universe, the new earth is not ready for living beings. It has to receive moisture, water or blood of a primordial creature. In many traditions, it is only after the earth has been fertilized by blood that it can support life. So something has to die. And this is a link back to the, Pangu and Ymir and that great giant that dies for us, or, that the idea of Odin sacrificing himself for us, or even of Jesus sacrificing himself for us. He says, frequently, Father Heaven and Mother Earth are the primordial gods. Their children are the Greek Titans, Indian Asuras, or Japanese Kuni no Kami. Their younger cousins are the Olympian gods, the Indian Devas, the Japanese Ama no Kami, who depict their older cousins as monsters who have to be slain. So what I want to point out here is that in all these cultures we just talked about, in India and Japan and in Greece, and it extends beyond that, but these are really clear examples of sort of two families of gods, an older and a younger generation, and they have to clash, and one side has to win. And we see this theme in Japan, Greece, and India very, very clearly. And so the older gods, the Titans, the first round of gods, these are the monsters that have to be slain. All right, Witzel says, most prominent among these fights is the slaying of these monsters by the great hero, a descendant of Father Heaven. In India, it is Indra who kills the three-headed reptile Vrtra, just like his Iranian counterpart Oratona. In Japan, Susanoo kills the eight-forked dragon. The same is echoed in Beowulf in England, Sigurd in the Icelandic Edda, and Heracles killing the Hydra of Lerna. Closely related is the Slavic myth of the hero's fight with Veles. So everywhere you see this slaying of the great monsters or the slaying of the dragon. He says in ancient Egyptian myth, the victorious sun, Re, slays the dragon of the deep, Apophis, each night when he passes underground so as to rise again. So this is the triumph of the sun. The sun has to defeat the dragon of night so that it can reemerge the next day, so it can be reborn and resurrected. And so that's an ancient Egyptian story about the slaying of the dragon Apophis. In ancient Greece, the motif is first found in the Homeric hymn where the sun deity, Phobos Apollo, kills a dragon, Python, in a way that echoes the slaying of Tiamat by Marduk and Vrtra by Indra. So the Mesopotamian and Indian versions. And the Homeric hymn quote goes like this: the son of Zeus killed the great she-dragon, a plague among men, and so she left her life breathing forth in blood. So the great dragon left her life breathing forth in blood. There's something about the blood that is still breathing, that is carrying the life force, the divine energy that the earth needs during its creation process. It's that little bit of God, that in the Bible that's breathed into Adam, with a little bit of God that's breathed into the cosmos when God's spirit was on the surface of the deep. A little bit of God needs to be in there to bring it to life, to make it something. And you see that here, the blood of the dragon. He says the Hittite myth of Eleuankis, that's the eel snake, tells of the fight of the storm god with a giant snake. So the serpent is associated, of course, with the dragon. And in China, in the Huananzi, Nauga, the second of the primordial emperors, killed the black dragon. Then men could live on earth. So the dragon needed to be slain before men could inhabit the earth. And this is an interesting one to round up this section with. It comes from Polynesia. He said in Polynesia we have myths of a fallen chief. We have, and that's associated with a lying lizard named Ilaoha. Ilaoha is at a tree with forbidden fruit, the forbidden fruit of Kane. right? So you have a fallen king, let's call him Adam, a lizard that's lying, right? We'll call that the serpent, and a tree with forbidden fruit. You see where I'm going. Witzel says, this myth has correspondences not just in the Bible, but also in Greek myth, right? There's a serpent at the foot of the tree of the Hesperides in a garden bearing golden apples. So that's the Greek version of the myth, the Garden of Hesperides with golden apples. A snake present in all versions. And that brings me to the next section. The theft of fire is what I'm going to call it. The theft of fire. Witzel says the locus for the theft of fire is the Greek myth of Prometheus. Most people know this story. Prometheus steals fire from the Olympian gods for the benefit of humans, and he's punished by Zeus. He's chained to a rock where an eagle daily eats his liver until eventually he's freed by Hercules. And it's important to know that the name Prometheus is derived from the Indo-European prometh, which means to steal. I kept that in because it kind of blew me away. I was always told that in Greek, Prometheus means forethought. You know, Prometheus means forethought. And the Latinization of that idea of the fire bringer, Prometheus is the fire bringer. You know, in Latin that comes down as lucis fer, the fire bearer. And lucis fer, of course, is where we get the word Lucifer. So I was always very intrigued by the myth of Prometheus and never understood why the name was significant. Forethought. I mean, significant to the story. But Witzel's just told us, if you take the Greek and you rewind the clock back to the Indo-European language that modern Greek or classical Greek came from, you're going to find prometh means to steal. Prometheus. Isn't that interesting? He says it's also found in Japan, among the Uralic, and most Austric speakers. These are Indonesians, Micronesians, Polynesians, and also in the Americas. He says from the Han ethnic group in western China, he gives us a quote here, in the beginning, there was no fire, and mankind lived in dread of cold and darkness. A young man named Acha determined to obtain fire from the monster who had it in his possession. While the monster was asleep, he stole the fiery pearl and swallowed it. At home, he took a knife and cut open his chest so he might release this fireball. The pearl rolled out and brought light to the world, but Acha died from the burns. So you have, just like Prometheus being chained to the rock and having his liver eaten out every day, you have the hero who brings fire to man, Acha, who also is killed in the process of bringing fire to man. So isn't that interesting? And he says you see that not just in Greece, but you see it in Indonesia, Polynesia, in the Americas, in China. Isn't that interesting? And it's in that bringing of fire is always associated with the bringing of civilization. You know, what happens when human beings have fire? Once we have fire, then we can cook our food. Then we can figure out how to extract ore, metals from ore. Then we can make tools and weapons. You know, we can fire harden our wood. We can do all kinds of things that build civilization. Not to mention sitting around the fire, telling our stories and myths. So fire is always associated with civilization. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call theft of the food of the gods. So we talked about stealing fire. Now let's talk about stealing the food of the gods. All right, Witzel says, humans everywhere were quick to explore and discover the mind-altering effects of certain plants, including the fly-agaric mushroom, ephedra, hashish, bang, beetle, peyote, coca, tea, coffee, cacao, fermented honey, wine, beer, and kava. Most of them were used in shamanic practices. The myths connected with such plants often attribute the sacred drink to the deities who use it as their own drink. The classical Greek case is that of the theft of ambrosia from the mountain by an eagle. Ambrosia, it's important to know, and it literally means, ambrotos means immortal. Its other name, nectar, is also derived from the Indo-European nek, which means to perish, and the suffix ter. So it means to overcome death. So the food of the gods is always associated with immortality, just like the fruit in the Garden of Eden, the fruit from the tree of life, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is the herb of immortality, and on and on. Witzel says the Vedas speak of Soma. In the old Iranian version, it's Homa, and it was stolen by an eagle as well from a mountain, just like ambrosia in the Greek myth. In the Germanic myth, mead was stolen by Odin, who needed it to create sacred poetry. In China, the drug of immortality was stolen by Shi Wang Mu and brought to the moon. In the Pontic and Near Eastern area, wine played a similar role. Wine plays a significant part even in Christian ritual as the blood of Christ in the Mass, as it did in the Greek mystery cult of Dionysus. I think this is interesting. I mean, this is associated with shamanism, the use of psychoactive drugs. It's also connected to that journey to heaven and hell, that journey up and down the mountain, up and down the pole, that shamanic experience. And that's at the very heart, at the very origin of human spirituality. And that brings us now to the creation of humans. Witzel says that semi-divine characters, such as the Indian Manu, the Greek Hercules, the Japanese Jimmu, and the Incan Viracocha, or the Polynesian Honua, represent the beginning of humankind on Earth, and most of them trace their origins back to the sun god. So human beings originate from a semi-divine, usually hero-type character. And so what's important to know is that the gods are created first, and then these semi-divine sort of halfway mortal things come into being, and then from there human beings are the fully mortal. So you kind of see this process of undeification. I don't know, I'm just making it up, but they're start off as being totally spiritual divine beings, and then we have this transitionary period to the semi-divine heroes, and then to regular human beings. And they're associated with the sun deity, these heroes. He says the Egyptian pharaoh is the son of the solar god Atum or Amun-Ra. Likewise, the Chinese emperor is the son of heaven. With the Aztecs, the sun produces two children from whom humankind descends. And the Inca think of their emperors as the children of the sun. In comparing various Laurasian versions, it seems that divine beings become mortal one or two generations down from the solar divinity. It all starts from the sun. And it reminds me of some of the people we've talked about in the past, like Emanuel Swedenborg, who talked about the sun or stars as being basically these portals where the spiritual energy or being of God gets transformed into the material reality of the cosmos. So the suns or stars are like portals from the spirit world into the material world, and everything that creates the material world, matter and consciousness and the whole kit and caboodle, is some sort of a transfiguration of God pouring through the sun. And so these stories are talking about the sun being the origin of creation, and especially of human beings. I think that's interesting, especially when you consider the facts of the situation, that the sun most certainly is responsible for life and most certainly has formed the cosmos, as they do wherever suns are, right? In the Earth, the solar system rather, in the cosmos. All right. So while we're talking about the creation of humans, let's do this little bit here. It's called the dust of the earth. And Witzel says, Stories of the creation of humans from clay are widespread. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, in the Hebrew Bible, and a very similar version with the Basari in West Africa, humans were created from clay. In China, with the Dayak, in Polynesia with the Maori, and in Hawaii, where Kane molds Kumu Hanoa out of wet clay. He is a chief along with his wife, until she meets a great seabird and is seduced to eat the sacred fruit of Kane. His wife goes mad and becomes a seabird. I only leave those details of the Hawaiian version in because they are so similar to the Eden story. So human beings are created out of clay. The first woman is seduced by a seabird into eating the sacred fruit and then ends up going mad. She's punished. It's just like we see with Eve and Eden, isn't it? And then that brings us to the Great Flood. Witzel says, the motif of descent from heaven or from a high mountain is often connected with that of a flood that wiped out nearly all humans. It is best known from the biblical story of Noah and from the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh epic. The Indian version, the flood of Manu, is of roughly the same time period as the composition of the biblical myth. And all these versions agree that a great flood covered all lands and only a few humans survived on a boat. When the flood receded, it got stuck on a mountain and the survivors come out to repopulate the earth. The biblical version stresses the flood as a punishment for an evil deed. The Mesopotamian gods grew restless because of the constant noise of humans and decided to kill them. This element of retribution or revenge by a deity is a feature of the myth wherever it is found. So the flood is always associated with punishment. The motif of the Great Flood, let's see here, sorry guys, the phone is going off here. The motif of the Great Flood is found all over the Laurasian area, from Ireland to Old Egypt to Siberia, China, India, Indonesia, Polynesia, and the Americas, including the most isolated tribes in the Amazon and in Tierra del Fuego. The absolute outskirts of everywhere. You can still find these flood stories. He says, even in the Philippines and in Taiwan. So basically everywhere in this Laurasian area. And that brings us to the final destruction, which of course, as you know, is the end of this storyline. Witzel says, Laurasian mythology also tells of the destruction of our world, the Götterdämmerung or Ragnarok, Shiva's destructive dance of fire, or destruction by molten metal in the Zoroastrian myths, or by fire and water in Mayan myth, or as in the old Egyptian tale of Atum's destruction of the earth. The final destruction is often coupled with the hope for a new and perfect world to rise from the ashes. And we see that, of course, in the biblical Armageddon and New Jerusalem. And so we can reformulate now the major Laurasian myths and myth themes. I know we kind of went over 15 earlier. Let's recap here more concisely. If we had to recreate what is common among all of these Laurasian myths so that we can come up with some kind of a broad outline of what was the original stories that spread throughout the world, this is what we would have. Creation from nothing, from chaos. A Father Heaven and Mother Earth deity being there in the beginning. Multiple generations of gods being born from this original pair, this original Ouroboros. And we have 4 or 5 generations or ages that proceed after heaven is pushed apart from the earth. The current gods are defeated. This is the killing of the dragon. Humans, usually descendants of this sun god, they fall into hubris or evil, and they're punished with a flood. Culture is brought to human beings, stolen from the gods, or brought from the gods to be a blessing and a curse, to human beings, and they spread all over the world, human beings. This is where the local history begins, where the mythological history ends and the real history kind of begins, and that leads all the way up to the final destruction of the world and the emergence of a new heaven and a new earth, a new beginning, a new cycle to start all over again. And that brings me to my conclusion. Rather than waxing philosophical as to the meaning of these myths and the relationships between them, to bring us home, I think this time I'm going to leave you with a few questions to chew on. Why is it, do you think, that human beings have always and continue to tell themselves the same stories across time and space? How is it that despite changes in geography, culture, and language, the central meaning of these myths have been preserved for 40,000 years or more? If these stories are so important that they've outlived civilizations and entire eons, why should they not unite us as human beings instead of devolving into those religious divisions that become perpetually murderous and destabilizing? What would it mean if we came to understand that all religion and all mythology roll back to one primordial revelation? If all the names and forms of God stem from one original intuition? What would it mean if that most ancient of prophets was the so-called African Eve, the common ancestor of all of humanity? What does it mean? What do you think?
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.